Okay, I think we're live. Yes, we're live. Good morning, everybody. Welcome back if you've joined us before, and welcome indeed if this is the first of the ITSM review series that you've tuned into here with us at Xcession. For those of you who aren't familiar with who we are, we're Xcession. We're an expert ITSM implementer and consultancy provider. We also do managed services and a whole lot more all around the ITSM space. But that's not what we're here to talk about today. This is the third in our 5-part review series, and today we're going to be talking about For Me. Very quickly, I'm Daniel Gilby. I'm an account manager here with Xcession, 20 or so years experience within the IT industry in varying guises. I've got my colleague with me, Sunil. Sunil, if you'd like to give us a quick intro to who you are for the audience.
Thank you, Dan. Yep, Sunil Dougal. So I'm the CRO of Xcession. My background for the last more than a decade has been working with customers to try and do more with their ITSM toolsets. So very excited again, as we have been through this series, really to be talking about For Me.
Okay, thank you, Sunil. And then just to set the scene about what we're going to be doing, as with the other reviews that we've carried out so far, really is just a high-level overview of the solution set. We talk about various features, functionalities, areas of capability, and so on, and then give a view on what kind of organizations, as we see it, that tool set would be most appropriate for. Today, I'm very excited, actually, because we're talking about For Me, and as Sunil and I will get into, this is a very different approach to service management, takes a different slant on it, but we'll talk a bit more about that as the session continues. We like to have a lot of engagement where possible, so please, leave comments, chime in, add your thoughts, contradict us if you feel we're talking nonsense. But I'll just start off with a very quick question to the audience there. Have you heard of For Me before this? they're a relative newcomer to the ITSM scene. So just give us a yes or no and a show of hands if you're here. That'd be great. Thank you.
And if you have heard of them, comments around what you've heard and what you've picked up so far would be great. If you have not heard of For Me, then I'd be really interested to know what's brought you to this session, because you'll learn something new and very interesting, we think, but interested to know why you've come along.
Brilliant. All right, shall I pop some slides up on screen, Sunil?
Let's go.
All right, okay. Well, we've talked about who we're reviewing. I'll skip on. And then, just very quickly, this will be included in the slide pack that we send out to anybody who would like a copy. Won't dwell on that too much. But just to touch on one point here, actually, should have mentioned this earlier. Xcession, we are a vendor independent and vendor neutral, in fact, organization. We're not aligned with any one specific ITSM solution provider. We do partner with them, but we don't have any specific affiliation, just to call that out. Sunil, this is you.
All right, thank you, Dan. So just before I talk about this, I'm just going to echo what Dan said earlier around being really excited to talk about For Me, because it has a different approach, and hopefully you'll get a flavor for that different approach as we go through today. But not just for today, but for the next 2 sessions after this, where we look at Fresh Service and Jira Service Management. I'm really excited about these 3 because the last 2 sessions really have been focused on, I suppose, the older behemoth in the ITSM
world. Established players.
And now the current, market leader. But actually what's happening, I think, and we're seeing it a little bit in front of us now, is a slightly different approach that is being taken by SaaS ITSM vendors. And you can see some commonality across For Me, across Fresh Service, and across Jira Service Management in things like, they are trying to be as simple and as easy to implement as possible. They are trying very hard not to leave a significant TCO overhead, total cost of ownership overhead, right, in terms of administration and ongoing running costs. They are trying to be very transparent around their licensing models. Published prices, for example, not for Me, but for the others, there are prices that are published. And what they're trying to do, though, whilst doing all of these other things, is offer maybe 80% of the functionality. So they're really trying to hit the market where perhaps the larger players might have existed, but customers have found it very difficult to drive that value out. So I think we'll see a little bit of a theme across the next three months. But anyway, focusing back on today, so our review criteria, and this is consistent across all of the series really, is to try and give people who are interested in these tool sets an understanding of what they kind of need to know. So we're not going to delve into how you build a service request, right? But what we're going to talk about is what it's like to work with end user and agent side of things. We're going to talk about administration, some of the more advanced functionality around CMDB and how it might fulfill more advanced ITSM use cases. Talk about the extensibility of the system across the enterprise, so outside of IT. Talk about what that platform offering is, and then we'll touch on, how much is this going to cost to implement, to run. So really, that's our criteria. It's not comprehensive. There'll be other things that are important. Tell us in the comments if there's something that you want us to talk about. We won't be able to do it today, but we can come back to you and certainly try and answer any questions that you might have there. So let us know. So moving on, so I've given you a bit of an idea in terms of for me and how it's trying to approach the market. But if you actually look at the For Me solution, it's really differentiated in three key ways. And we'll see this as we go through. So the first one is that it's based around services and not around processes so much. So configuring services, not building processes in the tool. It has this concept of trusted domains, which makes the extensibility alongside the service centricity, but the trusted domain side of things makes the extensibility across the business easy. But it also has some very interesting benefits when you look at service providers that sit outside of your organization. So we'll talk a bit about that as well. And then the third area that really, I think, differentiates is its consumption-based licensing model. So when we look at total cost of ownership, we'll just sort of drill into that a little bit more as well. So, it's trying to do things really differently. We'll leave it up to you guys to work out whether you think it is or isn't successful in that as we go through. I mean, Dan, you've been in the industry for a while. This is a new approach, isn't it?
No, 100%. I really like the idea of the service-centric, where they're looking at it as though, well, it doesn't matter, if your email's not working, it's a service you're requesting. Somebody, can you come and fix my email? In the classic ITIL world, that's an incident. There's a clear definition around that. And, don't get me wrong, that works really well. But ultimately, they're saying everything is, we're going to provide you with a service. You need something, whether it's your email to be fixed, access to an area on your your domains or infrastructure, or you need a new laptop. You're asking for something to happen. And they've taken that angle at it, which is, I think is very interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, to pick up on that point, from an end user perspective, there is no such thing as an incident in For Me. All requests. My request is that you fix my email.
Yeah.
But having just called out the differentiators, in that positive way, I think we have a small elephant in the corner that we need to deal with here, which is that the interface is perhaps not as modern in the For Me toolset as other toolset providers out there. Now, in no way is it going to negatively impact on the way in which it's used either by agents or end users, but it's just not as pretty as it could be. Think, I might offend some people here, but think Renault versus Peugeot. Yeah, Peugeot got super fantastic styling on their cars. Renault are trying hard, but they're not quite there.
Opinions are your own, Sunil, right? Let's just call that out quickly.
Other French car manufacturers may also be available. But if we look at this from an agent perspective, it's user-friendly, right? It offers what's needed, but the configuration element is relatively limited. From an end-user portal perspective, there's much more configuration options than the agent side of things. But what you will see is that it's simple and functional rather than beautiful, as some vendors might describe their tools. And on both sides of these, actually, you need to be aware that it takes some scripting. It's built in HTML, JavaScript, and CSS. Relatively straightforward, right? I mean, certainly on the agent side of things, configuration of the interfaces is fairly limited. So in terms of what you can do, that's fairly limited. On the portal side, there's more there. But I think the other thing is that, once you've built a script for a particular service request, then you can just, copy and amend that for something different. So once you get the hang of it, pretty straightforward. For me, have released fairly recently this concept of a shop, right? It adds a useful layer on top of the portal. So, there is definitely a move there in terms of making it as user-friendly for the end user as possible. One thing to note, though, that for me does not offer a virtual agent right within its core application at the moment. So if you need a virtual agent, you're looking at a third-party system to provide that. Let's move on to implementation and administration. So some key things to understand here. Because of the service centricity of the product, implementation requires customers and implementers like Xcession to think differently. So whereas in a more traditional approach, you would ask a customer in a workshop to describe their incident management process as an example, for me, you're not asking them to do that. You're asking them to define their services. And that, as I say, is a way of thinking differently. Now, our experience of this and our customers' feedback to us is that once they get their head around it, once they understand the templates in order to build out those services, then it's actually quite a refreshing way of doing things, and they get the hang of it, and it's quite easy to roll through. But there is that change in thinking that needs to happen fairly early on, right, in the process. And implementation times for me, we find, are somewhere in the sort of mid-range, right? They're not long cycles that you might get with BMC or ServiceNow. They're also, arguably, yes, you can roll something out very quickly, but for most organizations, we're talking sort of 6, 8, 10 weeks, something like that, not 3 months plus, but also not 2 weeks. Configuration is, as per the interfaces, pretty straightforward, but there might be some scripting skills there. But if you've been in the ITSM world, as the people at Xcession, our delivery team have, then you can get your head around the service centricity. Then that's you can get your handle on this pretty easily as well. Some other points, right, that are really relevant here. So from an administration perspective, there's not a huge amount of effort that needs to go into that. The platform is super stable and it is fast. So for me, have said that they want this solution to be fast. They never want someone to be looking at a timer, and it works, right? It's super fast. They also have a weekly feature and upgrade release cycle, which is really beneficial in a number of ways. One is that you're not building up to an upgrade on a sort of 6-month basis or whatever it may be. Okay. The other thing is that they're very proactive at taking customer feedback, right, in terms of feature development and putting it into their development lifecycle and releasing these features over this weekly release cycle. So it makes it very good, right, in terms of actually getting additional functionality into production. So from an admin perspective, it works very well. From a reporting perspective, so the data model in for me is sacrosanct, right, which means that reporting then is limited to exactly what's built in the data model. And you cannot build your own reports or customize reports. Having said that, there's a couple of important points here. One is that For.me comes out of the box with hundreds of reports, and you can apply filters to those reports as well. So there is a huge volume of reporting that exists already, and we have not had an instance that I'm aware of anyway of a customer saying, I cannot see the data that I want to see. And you can export the data if you really have to into Power BI or whatever. The second thing, though, is that because For.me works with this concept of service centricity, it is much less reliant on categorization by service desk triage or whatever it may be. So actually, what you get from For.me is a very service-centric view of what's happening. So you can build cost models, for example, based around services. You can see the performance of specific services within your organization, or services that you might be providing to an external organization, very simply and easily. So there are some real benefits in terms of the way that it's been built. But if you have a very unusual reporting requirement, then you might need to talk to For.me and get them to help you build.
Yeah, I was just going to mention that, because some of the feedback we've had is, okay, I can't build my own reports, but equally people who have For.me in situ, they found that if there is a report that they require that isn't there, unlikely, they can feed that back to For.me, and because they have that rapid cycle of development and implementation of features and requests and so forth, it's typically not long before then that report is made available to them, right? I'm right in saying that, yeah.
Absolutely right. Yeah, absolutely right. I mean, I think, as I understand it, someone from For.me could correct me here, but the more customers that shout about requirement, the higher up the priority list it goes. But yes, I mean, that is, and actually For.me is, as I understand it, it's super transparent in terms of where they are in their development life cycle and where your feature request may be. So the other point I think is important here is that integrations use a third-party system called Workato. And Workato is it's an excellent solution, works really well. The only point, and we made this point also with the BMC review that we did, is that reliance on a third party may introduce some uncertainty into the roadmap, but nothing that I'm aware of that is to be considered now, but something that I think people should.
Just an awareness point, really, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
exactly. But if you've got a different view on that, let us know.
Yeah, indeed.
So I'm going to whiz through the CMDB slide a little bit, because really it offers all the functionality that you'd expect. Okay, so there's visualizations and all that kind of stuff that you might see, but it relies on Workato as the integration tool to bring data into the CMDB, and there is no native discovery solution. So unlike VMC or ServiceNow, for example, it's but I guess the key point here is that there's lots of configuration options here in the CMDB, and it's customers are using it with the outputs that they would expect. So nothing perhaps really of significant note here. But what is worth spending a bit more time on is the enterprise service management view of For.me. And so a couple of, I suppose, anecdotal points here around this first. Unusually, in the ITSM world, For.me really genuinely can be used anywhere in the organization because of the service-centric approach. So, an email service is just as easy to configure as a service that HR or facilities or finance might provide. There is, in some of the language, perhaps a slightly more focused around IT approach, but again, configure the service. It doesn't matter whether it's inside of IT or outside. So that's the first point I think that we should pull out here. And as I said, anecdotally, right, ForMe has had a lot of success in landing in non-IT functions in organizations, i.e. the first place they sell, is not necessarily in IT. The second, I think here, and the point here to talk about is around this trusted domains concept. So the idea here is that you can configure business domains or indeed domains for third-party service providers, and if, for example, a request is raised in one domain and it has a trusted domain elsewhere, then it is immediately visible in that trusted domain too. So the example being, if I work for an organization and I have a ticket that I need to raise with a third-party service provider, I raise it in my ForMe instance and it immediately appears in their ForMe instance because they're a trusted domain. And they can then work on it. Any updates on their side of things is immediately visible on mine, right? It's not relying on an integration, it's relying on a trust. But what that means is, from a line of business perspective, right, it's super easy, and you're able to spread it across the organization very well. And that works really nicely for MSPs as well. I think, you can see that here, but it works really nicely for MSPs. So they have thought really long and hard about building this out as an ITSM toolset, and it works really, really well. From a platform perspective, so there is an app store that's available. There is obviously this service-centric approach and this extensibility into the organization, but perhaps it's unlikely that a CIO might consider ForMe as a application development platform in the way in which perhaps ServiceNow would be viewed. But what I would say is that the partner marketplace and the customer numbers are growing, and there's lots of innovation coming in. So a great example is there's a ForMe partner in Australia who built a tool set called AI Analyst. What it does is it supports on the agent side of things, service desk or resolver group users with things like summarizing, long email chains that have been appended to instance, as an example. It will do things like it will draft a suggested response to an end user based on knowledge articles and also the context that is written within the ticket, so in the notes or that's been appended via an email. It's sent to the agent can then click send that on to the end user, or they can amend it as required, but it's saving the time for actually drafting that end user response themselves. So, there's lots of innovation coming in here, and actually I think we expect to see it grow, right? We will see more around the ForMe platform, but at the moment it's got some work to do.
I think as well, it's interesting that the conversations that we, Xcession, have had as an organization with interested parties about solutions that are going to service their needs, ForMe comes up. And once people sort of get past that, well, what's this? We don't quite understand the service centricity model and so on and so forth. And when that mental leap or mental hurdle has been, passed, it actually makes a lot of sense. It's like, oh, okay, this is a really different, I'll say really different, it's a different way of approaching the same sort of challenges.
Yeah.
And then indeed, then it opens up this whole thing, well, I don't just have to use it for IT. It works equally well, as you've talked about, elsewhere within the business, and people see that and think, oh, significant advantages can be had there.
Absolutely.
So it's very very different in that regard.
Absolutely, that's exactly right. So let's look then around the TCO side of things. So before we talk about the licensing model, we've talked about some very positive things already here. So maintenance is straightforward and relatively inexpensive. Therefore, there's not a huge amount of time or third-party requirements required. There is a growing ecosystem, so partners like Xcession, but lots of other partners across Europe. And one of the things that's happened in For.me recently is that they've had some investment by an equity growth group called PSG. And as we understand it today, then that investment is going to be focused very much on increasingly developing that partner ecosystem. However, there are not a lot of skills today. I don't know if there's an independent contractor consultant marketplace out there. What we would say though is, and this is from our own experience, is that skilled ITSM consultants will be able to learn this technology set quickly. Okay, so that's that. That's very positive. And then the other piece is that For.me have lots of good artifacts, right? They've got a lot of training materials available, and they've got a really good customer success team. So skills developable, if that's a real word. And there are some partners out there like Xcession and others that are picking up this technology set. Let's just talk really briefly around the licensing model, because this is important. So unlike, as far as I'm aware, any competitor out there, For.me is offering a consumption-based licensing model. So what that means is that as a customer, you buy credits, and a credit is consumed when an agent logs onto the system in a month. So if they log on once in a month, 1 credit is consumed. If they log on every day for that month, 1 credit is consumed. So at the front end, you would buy a certain volume of credits, and as you go through your engagement with For.me, you will consume those credits. If you get to the end of year 1 and you have credits in the bank, so to speak, then your consumption for year 2, or your requirement to purchase credits for year 2, is reduced. If you anticipate that you're going to have an increase in agent numbers for a short period of time for whatever, maybe there's a project or something, right, then you can buy credits just for that increase in capacity. Indeed, if you are, for whatever reason, losing the requirement for people logging onto the system, then you can let your consumption of credits reduce as well. So it's pretty different, and I guess it makes a big, potentially makes a big cost benefit to organizations that are uncertain around what their consumption is going to be, right? It's worth noting though that you might need to pay for additional apps in the App Store, but it's also worth noting that 1 license, 1 credit gets you all the modules.
Yeah, I was just going to mention that. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, exactly, Dan. So unlike many of the others with published licensing models, Freshservice and Jira Service Management we'll talk about, or ServiceNow, which doesn't publish its pricing but has lots of options, shall we say, that you pay for. It's very simple in For.me. 1 license, all the modules.
Yeah.
And, approvers, end users, whatever. They're not licensed individually, shall we say?
I was just good. Yeah, the point I'd make on that, Sonal, as well, is that as you go along your maturity journey and you start to introduce additional capability, as we've just spoken about, you're going to start using another component within the solution. It's not like then a conversation with the vendor or your partner or whoever, can we get a license for this? It's Absolutely. Immediately accessible to you. So you just do what you need to do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it provides you, if you are a CFO, for example, right, For.me provides quite a compelling case here, because you're you should, in theory, be able to predict the cost of your service management tooling requirements quite accurately for, maybe 3 years. Yeah. So it's very positive in that regard. So who's it best suited to? I mean, we've just spent our time talking about, attractive total cost of ownership equation here. So any size of organization that's looking for a highly capable tool set at a reasonable price is going to be potentially interested in, for me. Organizations, so, I mean, let's give you an example, right? We have seen a number of customers who have historically worked with ServiceNow, have had, a service that they have been consuming that perhaps doesn't max out on the capabilities that ServiceNow provides, and have said, really, are we getting value for money here? And we talked about that challenge in our ServiceNow review. Go and check it out. So we've seen organizations like that looking at For.Me saying, well, this is a much more interesting model. Organizations that see service as key. So if you want to understand your services in detail, the cost of delivery of those services, the effort that goes into the delivery of those services, your ability to prioritize those services, to have SLAs associated with those services, etc. So anyone that sees service as key should be interested in this. Any organization that really wants to explore ESM, this is a very good tool set for the service centricity side of things. We talked about MSPs, or managed service providers, earlier, also a very good option for them. But I think if you're sat at that CIO, IT director, CEO, CFO, COO level, and you have struggled historically to balance the investment in service management tooling with the value that you get, right? You want to try something different, then For.Me is one to go and have a look at as well. So I'm going to be quiet now.
So that's our take on For.Me. Hopefully you found that interesting and insightful. Just pop this up. If you'd like a copy of the slides, of course, we offer this in each of these sessions. Just leave a comment and we'd be glad to send a copy across to you. And just on this, conscious that when we're aware that For.Me isn't the most well-known service management solution out there. So if there's anybody who would like to have a bit more of an in-depth conversation about this, maybe have a look at the tool set itself, I think fair to say Sunil would be very happy to facilitate that. So again, just get in touch, reach out to either of us via LinkedIn or through the Xcession website. More than happy to have that conversation. And then lastly, but not leastly, I'll just throw this up as well. We've mentioned Freshworks, we've mentioned Jira. They're our upcoming reviews. Freshworks is on the 26th, as you'll see on the screen now. So look out for an invite for that. It'd be great to have you join us again. Indeed, share with your network, tell your friends. And thank you all very much for your time.
Can I just very quickly say, sorry, just to be clear, that it is Freshservice we'll be talking about. Obviously, there's a broader set of tools in the Freshworks portfolio. But yeah, yeah.
Cool.
Don't come along expecting to hear us talk about Freshteam.
Well, come along anyway. It'd be great to have you with us.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right. On that note, thank you very much again, everybody. We'll see you next time.
Thank you.